Right, tonight I'm going to talk about what is suffering. Yeah, it is important to know what is suffering. Why is it suffering? So that we can know how to deal with it. Right. We have to know something before we can handle it. Right. So is suffering real? Right. Yeah, that is one of the questions. Now I want to read out what the Buddha says about suffering. The Buddha says, "Now this, bhikkhu, is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, union with what is displeasing is suffering, separation from what is pleasing is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the five aggregates subject to clinging are suffering." Right? So, is suffering real? Birth is suffering. How is it that birth is suffering? How is it aging is suffering? How is it illness is suffering? Death is suffering. So if there is suffering, how do we get rid of suffering? If suffering is in birth, is in death, is in illness, and is in all these things, so when you become enlightened, is there still suffering? Right? So is suffering in birth itself? Is suffering in death itself? Is suffering in illness itself? Is there something real in illness? Is there something real in death, in birth, and all the other suffering which the Buddha has said, separating from what is pleasing is suffering. So it's in that. If it is in something, it is supposed to be there. Right? So it is not in suffering, in the things itself, in an event. It is not in an event. Right? What we are talking here are events. The events of birth, the events of death, events of aging, events of illness, right? Event of union with what is displeasing, an event of separating from what is pleasing. So when we are talking this event, so is suffering in the event in itself. So if suffering is in the event itself, right, no matter who sees it, they will find the suffering in the event, isn't it? So even you're enlightened, right, you will find the suffering in the event. So what actually is suffering? If it's not in the event, right? So suffering cannot be in the event, right? If it's in the event, you become an arahant, then you will still see or feel the suffering in the event. Though the suffering is not in the event. But if suffering is not in the event, what is it? What actually is suffering? Is suffering real? You cannot say because it's not in the event, therefore it's not real, isn't it? Huh? It's not real, is it? When you suffer, is it real? The suffering is real. Right? Suffering is real. So you cannot say because it's not in the event, it's not in the thing, therefore it's not real. Right? You feel it, so it is real. So what is suffering? It's not something you can find in anything. Right? So it isn't anything. But yet it is real. The Buddha talked about the cause of suffering. The Buddha talked about the cessation of suffering. Okay? And we all know that from the second noble truth, that craving is the cause of suffering. Right? Longing is the cause of suffering. Right? So what about illness? Does illness belong to craving? Is it related to craving? Is it related to longing? It is related to longing. It is related to craving because we want to crave to be better. Longing to be what we used to be. Right? So these are the cause of suffering. So what is suffering in itself? For one thing we know, suffering is a feeling. Right? So it is a gentle feeling of stress, right? A little bit more distress, right? And to the great suffering of grief when you lost somebody. Yeah. So it is a feeling, right? So suffering is a feeling that is created by not getting what you want. By longing for what you have lost. Right? So suffering is real. Right? So because the cause of suffering is craving for something, which is the cause. If you take away the cause, then there is no effect. Right? Longing for what you used to have is the cause of suffering. If you take away the longing, then there isn't this effect. So suffering is a feeling that is caused by craving, caused by longing. Right? So the end of suffering is simply the end of craving, an end of longing. It is as simple as that. right? So it is a feeling that's created by these two, right, dhammas, craving and longing. Dhamma means phenomena, you know. So to eradicate suffering, all we have to do is extinguish craving, extinguish longing. You don't let craving arise. You don't let longing arise. Right? So suffering is not in anything. It is not in birth. It is not in death. Right? It is not in illness. It is craving to be better, and aversion to illness. That is the cause of suffering. Right? Um, in death, we have the fear of death. Right? In birth, is because when we are born, we start creating a world in which we crave for things. As soon as we are born, the first thing is we create mental identikits of the world, crave for mental identikits in the world. And then when we lose this mental identikit, we suffer. We hold on to this mental identity. Right? So the craving is not in the body. No, suffering is not in the body. Suffering is not in the mind. Right? Suffering comes from craving. And when there is craving, then there is suffering. Right? Suffering does not exist permanently in the mind. Suffering does not exist permanently in the body. Suffering has the cause, and that cause is craving. And the other cause is attachment. Because with attachment, when you lose the thing that you are attached to, then there is the longing. And the longing causes the feeling of pain. So suffering is not something that's permanent. Right? Suffering has a cause, and that cause is craving. And that suffering can be momentarily. You crave for something, and then as soon as you crave, you think I can't get it, and then you start suffering. Right? Can be momentary, or it can be a long-term longing. Right? Like if you lose something, someone dear, keep longing for them. So as soon as the longing is there is the suffering. So an arahant is somebody who has extinguished his craving, somebody who has extinguished his attachment. And that's all there is to it. Because there is no longer any craving, there is no longer any attachment, which are the two causes. Then there is no longer any suffering that can arise. Right? Any feeling that you can call suffering that arises. So an arahant cannot create a feeling of suffering. As simple as that. Because he has extinguished those two causes. So you want to know, right, that in the world there is no suffering. There's no suffering in things. There's no suffering in the five khandha. There's no suffering in the body. There is no suffering in the mind. So when is there suffering? There is suffering as soon as you crave. Right? That's how suffering arises. Suffering is waiting to arise when you have already been attached to something. When you are attached, longing happens when you become separate from what you are attached to. Right? Because attachment comes from craving. You start with craving, then you get what you have, which is attachment. Feel happy. You get what you want. The craving is finished. No more suffering. Happiness. Because you're attached to the things, that thing becomes part of you. It's attached to your mind. And it's part of your mind. You can say, or to make it more visual, it's part of your body. You treat it as part of your body. So when you cut this attachment off, you fall back to craving for what you have lost. It's longing. Right? So you're back into where you created suffering. Right? This craving. The Arahant have extinguished craving. When he has extinguished craving, anything above craving, which is attachment, becoming, those all do not appear. It is not part of his mind. It is not part of the process where he can reach. Right? His mind never goes beyond feeling. If craving arises, it ceases immediately. So it never goes beyond craving. Sometimes it never goes beyond feeling. So that's where he stops it. Stop that feeling. So you want to really get this right when you think about suffering, right? You only suffer when you crave. You only suffer when you're attached, when you hold on to something and you cannot get it. When you hold on to something and you are fearful of losing it. When you crave for something and you're not sure whether you can get it. Right? Fear of not being able to get it. Right? And when you have it, it's always the fear of losing it. Right? Nothing else causes suffering. You must remember that. It doesn't exist in anywhere. It is something that comes from craving. It is something that comes from losing what you are attached to. So it is part of the process of the mind. Nothing else. Right? Nothing else. In that part of the process of mind, we get to the point of craving. When we get to the point of craving, we want to use not sure to stop that craving. Right? The cessation of craving. Right? If not, the craving is there, then the suffering will continue. Right? When can I get it? How am I going to get this? Right? And the opposite of craving is aversion. I do not want this. Why is it still here with me? I do not want to be in this place. I do not want this life. I do not want to be in this family. I do not want to work here. That is suffering. See? So to know, that suffering has a cause. When there is a cause, then it arises. Whether it ceases or not depends on your process of your mind. Nothing else. If you're smart, then you say, not sure to whatever you're craving for. Not sure to what you are adverse to. Right? And that suffering ceases because the aversion ceases. You cannot be adverse to something which is not sure. You cannot crave for something that's not sure. You can't hold on to something that is not sure. Never mind crave for it. You cannot hold on to something that's not sure. Never mind being adverse to it. Right? When you lose something that you attach to, the longing is there. The longing is something that is difficult to get rid of. Because you have passed through that stage of craving to the advanced stage of attachment. It is fully attached to your mind already. So you have lost something which is valuable to you. Right? Because it is valuable to you, that's why you are attached to it. You see something in it. So when you're longing, you can still use not sure about the thing you have lost. Right? But the thing is, when you lose something, your mind always goes back to the time when you enjoy the thing, when you have the thing. Right? So you do not want to go to that. You want to say, not sure to this enjoyment. Not sure this is real happiness. Because it is a kind of delusion. What you are enjoying is just a mental identity. Right? So you try to break it down from there. Right? It's much more difficult with longing. So tonight, this talk is only about what is suffering. The process of that, I'll just give you briefly, an idea how to do it. But you have to keep in mind every time when you think of suffering, it is not something out there. It is not something that's in anything. It comes from the process of the mind. Right? It comes from wanting something. Right? And it's something that you want. It's just a mental identity. Or you're attached to something. Yeah? And things that you're attached to becomes precious to you. And when somebody does something to what you hold on as precious, then it is going to hurt you. So you do not want to see it as precious. When you are still attached to the thing, you want to say, this thing is not sure whether it's precious or not. However you see the thing, you apply not sure to the thing because it's empty of its good and bad, empty of what's right and what's wrong, empty of what's beautiful, empty of what's ugly. So when we have something that's precious, we always say it is good, it is beautiful, it is right. Huh? Now, so those things. So when say not sure to that, you know, then we don't hold on to that anymore. You know, as precious. You have to really keep in mind that I say that suffering is a process of the mind. So when you're feeling ill, you're not suffering yet. You're not suffering it really ill. But when you have aversion to your illness, that's when suffering arises. When you do not want to be ill, that's when suffering arises. Right. So when you're ill, right, you do not want that process to come out. The process of wanting and not wanting. That's where the suffering arises. And it's not in the illness in itself. Right? That is the first part of the suffering that you see when you're ill. But then there are other things as well that you manufacture when you're ill. You hold on to. And whatever you want to what you hold on to, you don't say not sure. You hold on to the idea, I'm not going to get well. I'm going to get worse. Right? And that's suffering. You hold on, I'm going to get better. But after a certain time, you don't get better, you get disappointed. And that is suffering. Or you turn around and say, I'm not getting well. And that is suffering as well. Okay? So, if you remember that suffering arises due to the process of the mind and holding on to something, right? Then you cut suffering by cutting through this process of the mind. Nothing else. Nothing physical. It has to do with the process that you've gone through. Right? Has to do with your views. It has to do with your desire. It has to do with your aversion. It has to do with your craving. Right? So that's why when we study reducing suffering, we find out the true causes. We stop the causes from progressing to suffering. As simple as that. That is cessation of craving, cessation of aversion, letting go of what you are holding on to, treating what you are holding on to as empty, as something empty. So, to a specific question in what is suffering, the answer: suffering is a feeling that arises due to craving, aversion, longing. Yes. Okay. Okay. Anybody have any question?